This is lesson 4 of week 22. We've already looked at Lamarckism, which was Lamarck's explanation for how organisms change over periods of time. Today we're focusing on Darwinism, Darwin's ideas of why and how organisms change over time. Darwin's ideas are also known as the theory of natural selection. Now, Darwin made the following observations based on his travels on the Beagle and also based on his observation of breeding programs at home. First of all, Darwin was intrigued by the fossils he found. He noted that fossils of extinct animals, although they were not the same as living animals, they were often similar and had similar features to organisms that are alive today. He suggested that one form had given rise to another. So what Darwin was suggesting here is that certain descendants that he found either as fossils or living today probably had common ancestors. Another of his observations was that lands with similar climates don't always have similar animals. And so he looked at the idea of biodiversity, and he suggested that biodiversity is not just a function of adaptation to climate and environment, but that sometimes something that was involved was inheritance, once again from a common ancestor. Darwin was very interested in island species, and of course we spoke in our last lesson about the Galapagos Islands. He noted that unique species on islands are often similar to those on the nearest mainland, and he felt that this suggested that island species, once again, could be descendants of common ancestors that existed on the mainland. He also noticed that there was a great deal of variation between very similar species on close islands. He suggested that all of the island species were descendants of a common ancestor on the mainland, but as they got separated on their different islands, they evolved differently due to being separated and due to there being unique climatic and environmental conditions on each of these islands. Another very, very important thing that Darwin noticed was the observations made by farmers and breeders of species such as domestic dogs, cattle, and pigeons. And he used these observations to make more observations of his own. And what he noticed was that breeding programs could change the organisms produced many generations later. He noticed how wild pigeons exist and how pigeons in captivity could be bred to, for example, have fantails or pouting breasts. And these changes that he observed in breeding programs, he related back to natural populations. And he suggested that if change could be made to happen, forced to happen in breeding programs, why could these changes not occur naturally as well? All of these observations led Darwin to propose the theory of natural selection. This is a mechanism for evolution. The key elements on which Darwin based his explanations were the following. Each species produces more offspring than can survive, or than do survive. Only a limited number actually survive in order to go on and produce more offspring of their own. And the reason for this is that there is limited resources, or there are limited resources in the environment, and there is competition amongst the organisms for those limited resources. The third important explanatory point is that individuals vary. So there's variation amongst the organisms. And it is those organisms that possess the traits or the characteristics that enable them to compete successfully. These organisms will be the ones that survive, and of course, if they're going to survive, they're going to have offspring of their own, and these offspring will carry these traits or characteristics that make their survival successful. Now, we know today that these traits or successful characteristics are, in fact, genes. Darwin did not know that at the time. Very ironically, Mendel was working on his theories of genetics and his laws of genetics at the same time that Darwin was developing his ideas and theories of natural selection. What would have happened if Darwin and Mendel had have sat down to compare notes? I think that discussion would have been a very interesting one. Of course, Darwin's theory suggests that those individuals that are not able to compete successfully, they do not have the traits that allow them to compete successfully, they will die. And they will die possibly before producing offspring, or their offspring will contain the traits that are not successfully allowing them to adapt to the environment. Darwin used a word to describe these organisms in the environment. Those that were able to compete successfully, he said these were fit organisms, whereas those that were not able to compete, they were less fit. Now, we mustn't think about fit as we do today. If you've been to the gym or you can run long distances, you're very fit. What he meant was these organisms are able to adapt to the environment. They're able to compete successfully and adapt to their environment. And those organisms, he said, were the fittest in the population, and therefore his idea was that the fitter organisms would have more offspring, and of course the genes or the traits that made them fit would be passed on to the offspring. This he called natural selection, or by another term, survival of the fittest. Those that can survive are the ones that are the fittest. And in his own words, he said, "Can we doubt that individuals having any advantage over others would have the best chance of surviving and reproducing their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations I call natural selection or survival of the fittest. Thank you, Mr. Darwin.